Desert Cactus Flower. Caroline Mercer had always known men like Jack Slade were trouble. But when he pulled her into the shadows of the barn, his hands rough and certain, she forgot every warning. He smirked, his breath warm against her ear. "You keep looking at me like that, sweetheart," he murmured. "And I might start thinking you want trouble." Chapter 1. A dust storm's embrace. The wind, a restless spirit, whipped across the plains, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and distant rain. Caroline Mercer tightened her grip on the reins, her knuckles bone-white against the worn leather. The sky, once a brilliant, endless blue, was now a swirling canvas of ochre and gray, the sun a hazy, forgotten memory. A dust storm, they called it. A beast of the plains, unpredictable and unforgiving. Just like life, she thought, a wry smile touching her lips. Caroline, at 58, had seen her share of storms, both literal and metaphorical. The lines etched around her eyes, the silver threading through her auburn hair, they were testaments to a life lived under the vast, indifferent sky of the West. A life that had known both joy and sorrow, love and loss, in equal measure. She was a woman of the frontier, her spirit as resilient as the weathered wood of her ranch house, her heart as expansive as the plains that stretched before her. The Mercer Ranch, nestled in a valley carved out by a meandering river, had been her home for over 30 years. It was a place of quiet beauty, of rolling hills and whispering cottonwoods, a sanctuary from the harsh realities of the world. But even sanctuaries could be breached, as Caroline knew all too well. The recent troubles with the encroaching railway, the whispers of land grabs and corrupt officials, they hung in the air like the dust that now choked her lungs. She urged her horse, a sturdy mare named Belle, forward, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She needed to reach the north pasture, to check on the herd before the storm hit full force. The cattle were her livelihood, her legacy, a connection to the husband she had lost 5 years ago to a fever that had swept through the territory like wildfire. Thomas. The memory of his strong hands, his gentle smile, his unwavering love, it was a constant ache in her heart, a bittersweet melody that played on repeat. The wind howled, tearing at her hat, stinging her eyes. Visibility was dropping rapidly, the world reduced to a swirling vortex of dust and grit. Belle whinnied, her ears pricked, sensing the growing unease. Caroline patted the mare's neck, her voice a soothing murmur against the roar of the wind. "Easy, girl. We'll be home soon." Home. The word resonated within her, a beacon in the gathering storm. But home was more than just a place, it was a feeling, a sense of belonging, of safety. And lately, that feeling had been elusive, replaced by a gnawing anxiety, a sense of impending doom. She thought of her daughter, Clara, married and living in the burgeoning town of Dust Devil Ridge, a day's ride to the east. Clara, with her bright eyes and unwavering optimism, was the light of Caroline's life. But even Clara couldn't completely dispel the shadows that seemed to be gathering around the Mercer Ranch. And then there was the matter of Jack Slade. The name itself was a whisper of trouble, a hint of danger that sent a shiver down Caroline's spine. He was a drifter, a hired hand who had arrived at the ranch a few weeks ago, his eyes as dark and enigmatic as the night sky, his past shrouded in mystery. He was a skilled horseman, a strong worker, but there was something about him, a restless energy, a hint of wildness, that both intrigued and unsettled her. He was a man who lived on the edges, a man who carried the scent of gunpowder and freedom. She'd caught him staring more than once, his gaze lingering a beat too long, a flicker of something unreadable in those dark depths. And she, despite her better judgment, had found herself returning his gaze, a strange mix of defiance and curiosity swirling within her. It was foolish, she knew. He was trouble, plain and simple. A man like him could only bring heartache. The storm raged on, the wind a relentless force that threatened to rip her from the saddle. She squinted, trying to make out the familiar landmarks, the twisted juniper tree, the rocky outcrop that marked the entrance to the north pasture. But the dust was too thick, the world a blur of brown and gray. Suddenly, a dark shape emerged from the swirling dust, a horse and rider materializing like a phantom from the storm. Caroline's heart leaped into her throat, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle sheathed on her saddle. Outlaws? Cattle rustlers? In this weather, anything was possible. As the rider drew closer, she recognized the silhouette, the lean frame, the way he sat his horse with an almost arrogant ease. Jack Slade. Relief washed over her, quickly followed by a surge of irritation. What was he doing out here in the storm? He reined in his horse beside her, his face obscured by the dust and the wide brim of his hat. "Mrs. Mercer," he shouted above the wind, his voice a rough, gravelly drawl that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "You shouldn't be out here." "I could say the same to you, Mr. Slade," she retorted, her voice tight with a mixture of relief and annoyance. He leaned closer, his eyes, dark and intense, meeting hers. "The herd," he said, his voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. "They're spooked. I was heading them off before they scattered." Caroline nodded, her gaze dropping to his hands, strong and calloused, gripping the reins. She swallowed, suddenly aware of the proximity, of the heat radiating from his body, even through the layers of clothing. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer now. He simply nodded, his gaze lingering on hers for a moment longer, a hint of something unspoken passing between them. Then, with a curt nod, he turned his horse and rode back into the swirling dust, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Caroline watched him go, a strange mix of emotions churning within her. Gratitude, yes, but also something else, something she couldn't quite name. A flicker of something dangerous, something forbidden. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. It was the storm, she told herself. The storm and the isolation. It was playing tricks on her mind. She turned Belle towards home, the wind at her back now, pushing her forward. The storm was still raging, the dust still swirling, but somehow it didn't seem quite as menacing anymore. She had faced the storm, and she had not been alone. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. She had a feeling that this was just the beginning. A beginning of what? She was not sure. Chapter 2. Shadows in the barn. The barn, a haven of weathered wood and the lingering scent of hay, offered a temporary respite from the relentless dust storm. Caroline unsaddled Belle, her movements practiced and efficient, her mind still replaying the encounter with Jack Slade. His unexpected appearance, his concern for the herd, his intense gaze at all left her feeling strangely unsettled. She rubbed Belle down with a rough cloth, the rhythmic motions soothing both the horse and her own frayed nerves. The mare nuzzled her affectionately, her warm breath a comforting presence in the dim, dust-filtered light. Outside, the wind continued to howl, rattling the barn doors and whistling through the cracks in the walls. "At least we're out of that mess," Caroline murmured to Belle, her voice echoing softly in the cavernous space. She finished tending to the mare and then turned to check on the other horses, making sure they were secure and had enough hay. As she moved through the stalls, her thoughts drifted back to Jack Slade. She couldn't deny the pull she felt towards him, a dangerous attraction that defied logic and reason. He was everything she should avoid a drifter, a man with a shadowed past, a potential threat to the peaceful life she had so carefully built. And yet she paused, her hand resting on the rough wood of a stall door. She remembered the way he had looked at her out in the storm, his eyes burning with an intensity that had both frightened and thrilled her. There was a raw, untamed quality to him, a sense of danger that was both alluring and terrifying. A sudden noise startled her, a creak of wood, a rustle of hay. She spun around, her heart pounding, her hand instinctively reaching for the small pistol she kept tucked in her waistband. It was a habit ingrained in her, a necessary precaution in a land where danger often lurked in the shadows. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice sharp and commanding. A figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the barn, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Jack Slade. "Just me, Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice low and calm, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "Didn't mean to startle you." Caroline lowered her hand, her heart still racing. "Mr. Slade," she said, her voice a mixture of relief and exasperation. "What are you doing here?" He stepped closer, the dim light illuminating his rugged features, the hard lines of his face softened by the shadows. "Came to check on the horses," he said. "Make sure they were all right." "I've already seen to them," she replied, her voice still a little shaky. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. "I know," he said. "I saw you." There was a silence, heavy and charged, the only sound the wind howling outside and the soft rustling of the horses. Caroline felt a blush creep up her cheeks, a warmth that had nothing to do with the lingering dust in the air. He took another step closer, closing the distance between them. She could smell the scent of him, a mix of leather, horses, and something wilder, something that sent a shiver down her spine. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. "It's not safe." "I can take care of myself, Mr. Slade," she retorted, her voice stronger now, though her heart was still hammering against her ribs. He smiled then, a slow, crooked smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, almost boyish. "I don't doubt that," he said. "But even the strongest of us need help sometimes." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Caroline felt a sudden urge to step back, to put some distance between them, but she found herself rooted to the spot, her gaze locked with his. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. He smirked, and it was that smirk, in the dim, shadowed light of the barn, that truly undid her carefully constructed composure. His breath was warm against her ear, a whisper that seemed to strip away the years, the grief, the loneliness. "You keep looking at me like that, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice rough and low. "And I might start thinking you want trouble." Caroline's mind went blank, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the weight of his words, his presence, his undeniable magnetism. She wanted to deny it, to push him away, to remind herself of all the reasons why this was wrong, why this was dangerous. But she couldn't. She looked at him, her eyes wide and questioning, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was trouble, she knew. But in that moment, surrounded by the shadows of the barn, the scent of hay and horses, and the roar of the storm outside, trouble was the last thing on her mind. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Only a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. The sigh of a woman who had been alone for too long, a woman who was starting to remember what it felt like to be desired. A woman about to make a choice. Chapter 3. The Weight of Whispers. The air in the barn hung thick and heavy, the silence punctuated only by the frantic drumming of Caroline's heart and the distant howl of the wind. Jack's words, his proximity, the raw intensity of his gaze, it all conspired to create a vortex of emotions she hadn't felt in years. Fear, desire, confusion, they swirled within her like the dust storm outside. He hadn't moved, his hand still hovering near hers, the warmth of his body a tangible presence in the cool, dim space. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken question that hung in the air between them. Caroline finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "Mr. Slade," he raised a finger, gently pressing it against her lips, silencing her. "Jack," he corrected, his voice a low rumble. "Call me Jack." His touch, light as it was, sent another shiver through her. She nodded, unable to speak, her mind racing. She was playing with fire, she knew. This man, this Jack, was a danger to everything she held dear. Her ranch, her reputation, her carefully constructed peace, it could all be shattered by a single, reckless act. And yet, she couldn't deny the pull, the magnetic force that seemed to draw her closer to him. It was as if a part of her, a part she had long buried, was suddenly awakening, yearning for something she had thought lost forever. He lowered his hand, his eyes still locked on hers. "Caroline," he said, her name a soft caress on his lips. It was the first time he had spoken her name, and the sound of it, spoken in his rough, gravelly voice, sent an unexpected thrill through her. She took a step back, breaking the spell, putting a sliver of distance between them. This is not appropriate, Mr. Slade Jack," she said, her voice still unsteady. We shouldn't be here like this." He didn't move, didn't try to close the gap she had created. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. "Why not?" he asked, his voice soft, yet challenging. Because she struggled to find the words, to articulate the reasons, the fears, the doubts that crowded her mind. "Because it's complicated." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that echoed in the stillness of the barn. "Life's complicated, Caroline," he said. "Doesn't mean you have to run from it." "I'm not running," she retorted, her voice gaining strength. "I'm being practical." "Practical?" He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Is that what you call it?" She felt her cheeks flush, a warmth that spread through her body. She was losing ground, she knew. He was too close, too charming, too dangerous. "I have a reputation to uphold," she said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "A ranch to run. A daughter and a life to live." He finished for her, his voice softer now, the amusement gone from his eyes. His words struck a chord within her, a painful reminder of the emptiness she had been carrying for so long. She had been living, yes, but it had been a half-life, a shadow of the woman she once was. She had been going through the motions, fulfilling her responsibilities, but her heart had remained closed, locked away behind walls of grief and fear. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze, her eyes focusing on the rough wood of the barn wall. The whispers of the town, the judgmental eyes, the unspoken condemnation, she had felt them all, ever since Thomas died. She had learned to live with the loneliness, the isolation, the constant struggle to keep the ranch afloat. But she had also learned to ignore her own needs, her own desires. "I don't know what you want from me, Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer again, his presence filling her senses. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her chin, tilting her face up to meet his. "I want you to be honest with yourself, Caroline," he said, his voice low and intense. "That's all." His eyes searched hers, as if looking for something hidden deep within. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he could see straight through her defenses, to the core of her being. She closed her eyes, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. She was trapped, caught between the fear of the unknown and the yearning for something more. She was a woman on the edge, teetering between the life she knew and the life she might have. When she opened her eyes again, he was still there, watching her, waiting. The storm outside had begun to subside, the wind dying down to a low murmur. The dust was settling, the light filtering through the cracks in the barn walls, painting the scene in shades of gray and gold. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a testament to the turmoil within. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping away the tear. "Don't cry, Caroline," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It doesn't suit you." She looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and despair. The weight of the whispers, the weight of her past, the weight of her fears, it was all too much. She wanted to run, to escape, to return to the safety of her solitude. But she also wanted to stay, to surrender, to let go of the burdens she had carried for so long. The choice was hers. And the silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Chapter 4. Beneath a bleeding sky. The silence in the barn was broken only by the soft snorting of the horses and the creak of old wood settling. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind an eerie calm and a sky washed clean, though bruised with the fiery hues of a setting sun. It was a bleeding sky, Caroline thought, mirroring the turmoil within her own heart. Jack's hand remained on her cheek, his touch a gentle anchor in the storm of her emotions. She hadn't pulled away, hadn't protested. A part of her, a long dormant part, craved the contact, the warmth, the simple human connection she had denied herself for so long. "I don't know what to do," she confessed, her voice a raw whisper, the words torn from the depths of her uncertainty. He didn't answer immediately, his thumb tracing a slow, deliberate circle on her cheek, the rough skin against hers a strange comfort. His eyes, dark and intense, held hers captive, searching, questioning, understanding. "There's nothing you have to do, Caroline," he said finally, his voice low and reassuring. "Except be true to yourself." His words, simple as they were, struck a chord within her. Be true to yourself. It sounded so easy, yet it was the hardest thing she had ever attempted. For years, she had been living a life dictated by expectations, by duty, by the whispers of others. She had suppressed her own desires, her own needs, in order to maintain the facade of the strong, independent widow, the capable rancher. But who was she really? Beneath the layers of responsibility and grief, who was the woman she had buried so deep? I don't even know who that is anymore," she admitted, her voice breaking with emotion. He smiled then, a gentle, understanding smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "Then maybe it's time you found out," he said. His words were an invitation, a challenge, a promise. An invitation to explore the uncharted territory of her own heart, a challenge to confront her fears and insecurities, a promise of what? Companionship? Passion? Love? She didn't know, and the uncertainty both terrified and exhilarated her. She took a deep breath, the scent of hay and horses filling her lungs, grounding her in the present moment. She looked at Jack, really looked at him, seeing beyond the rugged exterior, the dangerous aura, to the man beneath. She saw the lines of hardship etched around his eyes, the hint of sadness in his smile, the vulnerability he tried so hard to conceal. He was a mystery, yes, but he was also a man with his own demons, his own struggles. And in that moment, she felt a connection to him, a kinship that transcended the boundaries of their different worlds. "I'm afraid," she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Of what?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Of everything," she said, her voice trembling. "Of making a mistake, of being hurt, of a feeling again." He nodded, his gaze understanding. "Fear's a natural thing, Caroline," he said. "But it shouldn't control you. It shouldn't keep you from living." He reached out, his other hand joining the first, cupping her face between his hands. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, savoring the warmth, the strength, the comfort he offered. "Let me help you," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Let me help you find your way back to yourself." His words were a lifeline, a beacon in the darkness. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope, a spark of possibility. She didn't answer with words, but with a look that conveyed her vulnerability, her fear, but also her willingness to trust, to take a chance, to step into the unknown. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. It was a whisper of a kiss, a promise of something more, a moment suspended in time. She didn't resist, didn't pull away. She simply closed her eyes and let herself feel, let herself be present in the moment, let herself be kissed. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and hay, of sweat and leather, of longing and hope. It was a kiss that awakened something deep within her, a dormant fire that had been smoldering for years. It was a kiss that changed everything. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers, questioning. She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his, and in that moment, something shifted between them. The fear hadn't completely vanished, but it was overshadowed by something else, something stronger, something undeniable. The bleeding sky outside cast long shadows across the barn floor, painting the scene in shades of red and gold. The horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, sensing the change in the air. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. A decision had been made, unspoken but understood. The first step had been taken. Chapter 5. Scars of the Past. The kiss, brief as it was, lingered in the air between them, a tangible presence that changed the dynamic of the barn, of their relationship, of everything. Caroline felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a warmth that spread through her entire body, chasing away the lingering chill of the storm. Jack didn't speak, didn't press her. He simply watched her, his dark eyes searching hers, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. He seemed to understand the turmoil she was experiencing, the conflicting emotions that were warring within her. Caroline took a step back, breaking the physical connection, though the emotional one remained, stronger than ever. She needed space, time to process what had just happened, to reconcile the reality of the kiss with the years of self-imposed solitude. I need to get back to the house, she said, her voice still a little shaky, though stronger than before. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. I'll walk with you, he offered. She hesitated, then nodded. She wasn't ready to be alone, not yet. The silence of the house, the emptiness of her life, it was too much to face after the emotional upheaval of the past few hours. They walked side by side, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the familiar scent of leather and horses that clung to him. The setting sun cast long shadows before them, stretching and distorting their figures, making them appear larger than life, like figures from a legend. The silence was comfortable, not strained. It was the silence of two people who had shared a moment of intimacy, a moment that had changed the landscape of their relationship. As they neared the house, Caroline finally broke the silence. You said you came out to check on the herd, she said, her voice tentative. How did you know they were spooked? He glanced at her, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. I saw the signs, he said. The way the wind was shifting, the restlessness of the birds. I've been around cattle long enough to know when they're about to bolt. You've been around cattle a long time? She asked, curious despite herself. He nodded. Most of my life, he said. One ranch or another. Drifting, mostly. Drifting? He shrugged. Never found a place that felt like home, he said, his voice tinged with a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher. Sadness? Regret? Longing? She wanted to ask him more, to delve into his past, to uncover the mysteries that surrounded him. But she hesitated, afraid of breaking the fragile bond that was forming between them. They reached the porch of the house, the weathered wood creaking under their weight. The sky was now a deep indigo, the first stars beginning to appear, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. Thank you, Caroline said, turning to face him. For everything. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. My pleasure, Caroline, he said. He reached out, his hand gently brushing against her cheek, the same spot where he had wiped away her tear earlier. The touch sent a shiver through her, a reminder of the kiss, of the feelings he had awakened within her. Tell me about your scars, Caroline, he said suddenly, his voice low and intimate. It caught her off guard. My scars? He nodded slowly. Everyone has them. Most folk try to hide them. Yours, they run deeper than most, I reckon. She was momentarily stunned, confused about whether he was being literal or figurative. But his eyes told her everything. He saw her. All of her. How? She began, then stopped. She decided to be honest. The obvious one is Thomas. Losing him, it broke me. For a long while I just existed. The ranch kept me going and Clara, of course. But her voice trailed off. He nodded, encouraging her to continue. Before Thomas, there was another. A long time ago. A foolish girl's dream. He promised me the world, and I believed him. I was young, naive, stupid. He left me with nothing but a broken heart and a lesson learned. I swore I'd never be that vulnerable again. She looked away, ashamed even after all these years. I built walls, Jack. High ones. To protect myself. And have they? He asked softly. She looked back at him, her eyes meeting his. Until now, she whispered. Until you. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He didn't touch her, but his presence was overwhelming, his gaze intense. He looked long into her eyes, taking in all the vulnerability and past hurts she had divulged, before he spoke again. We all have scars, Caroline. Mine just happened to be a little more visible. He gestured vaguely with one hand. The gesture encompassed more than just his body, she realized. It encompassed his entire being. The mystery, the danger, the past. The unspoken invitation hung heavy in the twilight air. Chapter 6. A Renegade's Promise. Caroline's gaze followed his gesture, her mind filling with questions she dared not voice. His scars, they were more than just physical, she knew. They were etched onto his soul, a testament to a life lived on the edge, a life of hardship and perhaps violence. "What happened to you, Jack?" she asked, the words barely a whisper, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fascination. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze shifting to the distant horizon, his eyes darkening with a shadow of memory. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the soft sigh of the wind. Finally, he looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "It's a long story, Caroline," he said, his voice rough. "And not a pretty one." I want to hear it," she said, her voice stronger now, her curiosity overcoming her apprehension. He hesitated, his gaze searching hers, as if trying to gauge her sincerity.
"Why?"
he asked. Because I want to understand you," she said, her voice honest and true. "Because I care." The word hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge connecting their two disparate worlds. It was the first time she had admitted, even to herself, the depth of her feelings for him. He smiled then, a slow, crooked smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Careful, Caroline," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Caring can be dangerous." "I'm not afraid," she lied, her heart pounding in her chest. She was afraid, terrified even, but she was also drawn to him, to the danger, to the mystery, to the man she sensed beneath the rough exterior. He reached out, his hand gently tracing the line of her jaw, his touch sending a shiver through her. "You should be," he said, his voice a whisper against her ear. "I'm not a good man, Caroline." "I don't believe that," she retorted, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that echoed in the stillness of the night. "You see what you want to see, Caroline," he said. "That's a dangerous habit."
"Maybe," she said.
"But I also see a man who helped me in the storm, a man who cares about the herd, a man who," she hesitated, her voice trailing off. "A man who kissed you." He finished for her, his voice soft, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. She nodded, unable to speak, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her face. "That kiss, it meant something, Caroline," he said. "To me, at least." "To me too," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, almost vulnerable. "Then let me tell you my story," he said. "But be warned, it's not for the faint of heart." He led her to the porch swing, the weathered wood creaking under their weight. They sat side by side, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth of each other's bodies. The night was still and quiet, the stars twinkling overhead, the only sound the soft chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. He began to speak, his voice low and measured, his words painting a vivid picture of a life lived on the fringes of society, a life of hardship, violence, and loss. He spoke of his childhood, growing up on a small, struggling ranch in Texas, of his father, a harsh, unforgiving man who had taught him to fight for survival. He spoke of his mother, a gentle soul who had died too young, leaving him with a void that nothing could fill. He spoke of the day he had left home, a young man with nothing but a horse and a gun, determined to make his own way in the world. He spoke of the years he had spent drifting from town to town, working as a ranch hand, a bounty hunter, a gun for hire. He spoke of the men he had killed, the choices he had made, the regrets he carried. He spoke of the loneliness, the isolation, the constant struggle to stay one step ahead of the law, of his own demons. He spoke of a woman, a beautiful, fiery woman he had loved and lost, a woman who had been taken from him by a rival gang, a woman whose memory still haunted him. He spoke of the betrayal, the violence, the bloodshed that had marked his life, leaving him scarred, both physically and emotionally. He spoke, finally, of arriving in this God-forgotten country. Running. Always running. But running from what? Or to what? Even he didn't seem sure. Caroline listened, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had endured, for the life he had been forced to live. She saw the scars, not just the physical ones, but the deeper wounds, the ones that had marked his soul. I'm a renegade, Caroline, he concluded, his voice hoarse with emotion.
An outlaw.
I've lived outside the law for so long, I don't know any other way. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and despair. He expected judgment, condemnation, rejection. But he found none of those things in her gaze. I understand, was all she could find to say at first. It wasn't entirely a lie. She understood the why of him. Now, even if she couldn't condone all of the what. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Caroline, he said. Or your pity. I needed you to know. To understand who you're dealing with. I know who I'm dealing with, Jack, she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. I'm dealing with a man. A flawed, scarred, but ultimately human man. She reached out, her hand covering his, the warmth of her touch a silent offering of comfort, of acceptance. He looked at her, his eyes filled with surprise, with gratitude, with something else. Something that looked a lot like hope. I won't let my past hurt you, Caroline, he said, his voice a solemn promise. I swear it. The promise hung between them, fragile but real, under the vast, star-studded sky. Chapter 7. The Price of Freedom. Jack's promise resonated in the quiet night, a vow spoken with an intensity that both reassured and unsettled Caroline. She believed him, believed in his sincerity, but she also knew the weight of his past, the darkness that clung to him like a shadow. She squeezed his hand, her touch a silent affirmation of her trust, her acceptance. I believe you, Jack, she said, her voice soft but firm. He turned his hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, the simple gesture sending a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the day. But your past, it's not just going to disappear, she said, her voice hesitant, her gaze searching his. There are consequences. He nodded, his expression grim. I know, he said. I've been running from them for years. Running from what? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the distant horizon, his eyes darkening with a shadow of memory. From the law, he said finally, his voice rough. From the men I've wronged. She felt a chill run down her spine, a premonition of danger. What did you do? She asked, her voice trembling. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. Things I'm not proud of, Caroline, he said. Things I can't change. She wanted to press him, to demand details, but she held back. She knew he would tell her when he was ready, and she trusted him enough to wait. But you're not running anymore, she said, her voice a statement, not a question. He shook his head.
Not from them, he said.
But maybe I'm running toward something. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and longing, a vulnerability that made her heart ache. What are you running towards, Jack? She asked, her voice soft. A new life, he said. A chance to be a better man. He paused, his gaze searching hers. A chance with you. His words sent a wave of emotion through her, a mixture of fear and excitement, of doubt and desire. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe in the possibility of a future with him, but the reality of his past, the threat of his enemies, loomed large in her mind. It's not that simple, Jack, she said, her voice trembling. Your past, it could endanger everything. My ranch, my daughter, I would never let that happen. Caroline, he said, his voice fierce, his grip on her hand tightening. I swear it. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, and she saw the truth in his gaze, the unwavering determination to protect her, to protect what was hers.
But how? She asked.
How can you be sure? He smiled then, a slow, crooked smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
I have my ways, he said.
And I have friends. Friends? She asked, her voice skeptical. He nodded. Men like me, he said. Men who understand. She felt a shiver of unease, a sense of the dangerous world he inhabited, a world she knew nothing about. "But they're outlaws," she said, her voice hesitant. He shrugged.
"Some would call them that," he said.
"I call them loyal."
She didn't know what to say.
She was torn between her desire for him, her belief in his potential for redemption, and the fear of the unknown, the threat of his past. "I need time, Jack," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper.
"Time to think."
He nodded, his gaze understanding.
"I know," he said.
"Take all the time you need." He released her hand, the warmth of his touch lingering on her skin. He stood up, his tall frame silhouetted against the starlit sky. "I'll be around," he said.
"If you need me."
He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her. "One more thing, Caroline," he said, his voice low and intense. "The freedom you have, the land, the life, it all comes with a price. Sometimes that price is higher than you think." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, a warning and a promise all in one. She watched him walk away, disappearing into the shadows, leaving her alone with her thoughts, her doubts, her fears, and a glimmer of hope. The price of freedom. She'd always known there was one. She just hadn't realized how high it might be, or who she might have to pay it with. The nights suddenly felt colder. Chapter 8. Echoes of Betrayal. The days that followed were a blur of activity and quiet contemplation for Caroline. She threw herself into the work of the ranch, the familiar routines a welcome distraction from the turmoil in her heart. She checked on the cattle, mended fences, oversaw the branding of the new calves, all the tasks that demanded her attention, that kept her grounded in the present. But even as she worked, her mind was constantly replaying her conversations with Jack, his words, his touch, the kiss they had shared. She couldn't deny the pull she felt towards him, the magnetic force that seemed to draw her closer, despite the risks, despite the dangers. She also noticed a change in Jack. He was still the same hard-working, enigmatic man who had arrived at the ranch a few weeks ago, but there was a new intensity to him, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. He was more attentive, more protective, his gaze constantly seeking her out, his presence a reassuring constant in her life. He didn't press her for an answer, didn't push her for a decision. He simply waited, patiently, giving her the space she needed to come to terms with her feelings, with the reality of his past. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the vast expanse of the plains, Caroline finally broached the subject that had been weighing heavily on her mind. "Jack," she said, her voice hesitant, her gaze fixed on the fiery hues of the sky. "Those friends you mentioned.
Who are they?"
He didn't answer immediately, his gaze shifting to the distant horizon, his eyes darkening with a shadow of memory. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the soft sigh of the wind. Finally, he looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "Men I rode with," he said, his voice rough.
"Many true steed."
"And can you still trust them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. "Some of them," he said. "Others I'm not so sure." She felt a chill run down her spine, a premonition of danger. "What do you mean?" she asked. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression troubled. "There were disagreements," he said. "Betrayals." "Betrayals?" she echoed, her voice sharp. He nodded. "It's a long story, Caroline," he said. "And a complicated one." "Tell me," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of reluctance and resignation. He knew he couldn't keep the truth from her any longer, not if he wanted to build a future with her, a future based on honesty and trust. He began to speak, his voice low and measured, his words painting a vivid picture of a life lived on the fringes of society, a life of loyalty and betrayal, of violence and redemption. He spoke of the gang he had ridden with, a band of outlaws led by a charismatic but ruthless man named Silas Blackwood. He spoke of the robberies they had committed, the towns they had terrorized, the lives they had taken. He spoke of the code they had lived by, a twisted code of honor that justified their actions, that bound them together in a brotherhood of violence. He spoke of the growing unease he had felt, the doubts that had begun to creep into his mind, the realization that he was on the wrong path, that he was becoming the very thing he had always despised. He spoke of the final betrayal, the one that had forced him to flee, to leave behind everything he had known, to become a fugitive, a man hunted by both the law and his former comrades. He spoke of Silas Blackwood, the man who had been his mentor, his friend, his enemy. The man who now wanted him dead. Silas, he felt I betrayed him, Jack explained, his voice raw with the memory. By questioning him. By refusing certain orders. By wanting out. He took it personally. He always does. Caroline listened, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had endured, for the choices he had made, for the life he had been forced to live. She understood now the darkness that clung to him, the weight of his past, the threat that loomed over him. And Silas. He's still out there? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded grimly. He's still out there. And he never forgets. The echoes of betrayal hung heavy in the air, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. Chapter 9. Riding Through the Storm. The revelation of Jack's past, of Silas Blackwood, and the betrayal that had driven him into hiding, cast a long shadow over the Mercer ranch. Caroline felt a constant unease, a sense of impending danger that she couldn't shake. She knew that Jack's enemies were out there, somewhere, and that they would eventually come looking for him. She tried to hide her fear, to maintain a facade of calm for the sake of her daughter, Clara, who had come to visit for a few days. Clara, with her bright eyes and optimistic spirit, was a welcome distraction, a reminder of the simple joys of life. But even Clara's presence couldn't completely dispel the shadows that seemed to be gathering around them. Jack, too, was on edge. He was more vigilant than ever, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from the gun he carried. He was like a wolf, sensing danger in the wind, ready to defend his territory, his pack. One afternoon, as Caroline and Jack were riding back from checking on the herd, a storm began to brew on the horizon. The sky, once a brilliant blue, turned a menacing gray, the clouds gathering like dark, angry giants. The wind picked up, whipping their hair and carrying the scent of rain and dust. "We need to get back," Caroline said, her voice urgent, her gaze fixed on the approaching storm. Jack nodded, his expression grim. "Ride hard," he said. "We'll outrun it." They spurred their horses into a gallop, the wind screaming in their ears, the thunder rumbling in the distance. The landscape blurred around them, the familiar landmarks disappearing in a haze of dust and rain. The storm hit them with full force, the rain lashing down, the wind tearing at their clothes, the lightning illuminating the sky in brief, blinding flashes. Caroline struggled to control Belle, the mare spooked by the thunder and lightning. Jack rode close beside her, his presence a reassuring anchor in the chaos. He shouted encouragement, his voice barely audible above the roar of the wind, his hand reaching out to steady her when Belle stumbled. They rode through the storm, their bodies soaked, their faces stung by the rain, their hearts pounding in their chests. It was a wild, exhilarating ride, a test of their courage, their resilience, their connection. As they neared the ranch, the storm began to subside, the rain softening to a drizzle, the wind dying down to a gentle breeze. The clouds parted, revealing a glimpse of the setting sun, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. They reined in their horses, their bodies exhausted, their clothes soaked, but their spirits strangely invigorated. They had faced the storm, together, and they had survived. Caroline looked at Jack, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. He was drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, his clothes clinging to his body, but he looked magnificent. He was a man of the storm, a man who thrived in the face of adversity, a man who she loved. She realized it then, with a certainty that took her breath away. She loved him, despite his past, despite the dangers, despite everything. She loved his strength, his courage, his vulnerability, his wildness. He looked back at her, his eyes mirroring her own emotions, his gaze filled with a love that was both fierce and tender. "We made it," he said, his voice rough with emotion, a smile playing on his lips. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling.
"We did."
He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his touch sending a warmth through her that chased away the lingering chill of the storm. "I love you, Caroline," he said, his voice a whisper against her ear, the words a vow, a promise, a confession. "I love you too, Jack," she said, her voice choked with emotion, her heart overflowing with a love she had thought lost forever. He leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both passionate and tender, a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that defied the storm, the past, the future. It was a kiss born of shared adversity, of mutual respect, of undeniable love. They stood there, embracing, under the vast, clearing sky, the remnants of the storm a reminder of the challenges they had faced, the challenges they would continue to face together. The ranch house, solid and welcoming, stood in the distance, a beacon of hope. But even as they turned towards it, a single, dark figure watched them from the ridge, unseen, unknown, a harbinger of the storms yet to come. The figure was a silhouette against the last light of day, ominous and still. Chapter 10. Secrets Unveiled in the Moonlight. The embrace after the storm, the shared declaration of love. It was a moment of profound connection for Caroline and Jack. But the figure on the ridge, the unseen observer, served as a stark reminder that their newfound peace was fragile, threatened by the shadows of Jack's past. Back at the ranch house, Clara greeted them with concern, relieved that they had weathered the storm unharmed. She fussed over them, insisting they change into dry clothes and have a hot meal. Caroline, her heart still soaring from Jack's confession, found it difficult to conceal her happiness, her cheeks flushed, her eyes sparkling with a light that Clara couldn't help but notice. "You seem different, Mama," Clara said, her eyes narrowed with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion.
"Happier."
Caroline hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to her daughter. She knew Clara wouldn't approve of her relationship with Jack, not with his past, not with the danger he represented. "The storm, it was exhilarating," Caroline said, evading the question. "We rode through it together." Clara looked unconvinced, but she didn't press the issue. She was a perceptive woman, though, and Caroline knew she couldn't keep the truth from her daughter for long. Later that evening, after Clara had gone to bed, Caroline and Jack sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the moon rise over the plains. The night was still and quiet, the air cool and crisp, the stars twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. "I need to tell Clara," Caroline said, her voice low, her gaze fixed on the moon. "She deserves to know." Jack nodded, his expression somber.
"I know," he said.
"But be careful, Caroline. She might not understand."
"I have to try," she said.
"She's my daughter." He reached out, his hand covering hers, the warmth of his touch a silent offering of comfort and support. "I'll be there for you," he said. "Whatever happens." They sat in silence for a while, their hands clasped together, their hearts connected by a bond that was growing stronger with each passing day. "There's something else I need to tell you, Caroline," Jack said suddenly, his voice hesitant, his gaze shifting away from hers. She looked at him, her heart filled with a sense of foreboding.
"What is it?" she asked.
He hesitated, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with a mixture of reluctance and pain. "It's about the night I left Silas," he said. "There's more to the story than I told you." She felt a chill run down her spine, a premonition of something terrible. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, his voice rough with emotion. "There was a robbery," he said. "A bank in a small town, Silver Creek." Caroline nodded, her mind racing. She had heard of Silver Creek, a small mining town a few days' ride to the north. "We were supposed to just take the money," he said. "No one was supposed to get hurt." He paused, his voice choked with emotion, his hand gripping hers tightly. "But Silas, he lost control," he said. He shot a man. A young bank teller, Just a boy, really. Caroline gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes filled with horror. I tried to stop him, Jack said, his voice trembling. But it was too late. The boy, he died in my arms. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that was almost unbearable to witness. I ran, he said. I couldn't stay, not after that. I couldn't be a part of it anymore. He turned away, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, his body racked with guilt and remorse. Caroline reached out, her arms wrapping around him, holding him close, offering him the comfort he so desperately needed. She didn't know what to say, how to console him. She could only offer her presence, her love, her unwavering support. It wasn't your fault, Jack, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. You tried to stop him. But I was there, he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. I was part of it. I'm just as guilty. No, she said, her voice firm. You're not. You made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but you've paid for it. You've been paying for it ever since. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, under the watchful gaze of the moon, the silence broken only by Jack's occasional sobs and Caroline's whispered words of comfort. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, casting its silvery light over the plains, Jack finally pulled away, his face pale and drawn, his eyes red-rimmed. I'm sorry, Caroline, he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't want you to know. I needed to know, she said, her voice gentle. I need to know everything. He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude, with love, with hope. Thank you, he said, his voice barely a whisper, for not judging me. That night, under a revealing moon, secrets had been unveiled. The full weight of Jack's past and the depth of his remorse were now laid bare. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing remained clear. They would face it together. Chapter 11. The Sheriff's Shadow. The following morning, Caroline awoke with a heavy heart, the weight of Jack's confession pressing down on her. She knew that his past, his involvement in the Silver Creek robbery, would have serious consequences, not just for him, but for her and her ranch as well. She found Jack outside, tending to the horses, his movements practiced and efficient, but his expression somber, his eyes filled with a shadow of worry. We need to talk, she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. He nodded, his jaw clenched, his eyes meeting hers. He knew what was coming, the inevitable discussion of the future, of the risks, of the choices they would have to make. They walked to the porch, sitting side by side on the swing, the weathered wood creaking under their weight. The morning sun was warm on their faces, but the air was filled with a tension that couldn't be ignored. What are we going to do, Jack? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes searching his. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression troubled. I don't know, Caroline, he said. I wish I had an answer. We can't just pretend it didn't happen, she said. The law, Silas, they'll come looking for you. He nodded. I know, he said. And when they do, they'll put you and Clara in danger. I'm not afraid of them, she lied, her voice trembling. She was afraid, terrified even, but she was also determined to stand by Jack, to protect him, to protect their love. You should be, he said, his voice rough. Silas is a dangerous man. And the law, they won't show any mercy. Then what do we do? She asked, her voice pleading. He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the distant horizon, his eyes darkening with a shadow of thought. There's only one way, he said finally, his voice low and determined. I have to face them. Both Silas and the law. Caroline felt a chill run down her spine, a premonition of danger. No, she said, her voice sharp. It's too risky. You'll be killed. I have to try, Caroline, he said. I can't keep running. I can't keep living in the shadows. I have to make things right. But how? She asked. How can you possibly face them both? He smiled then, a slow, crooked smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I have a plan, he said, but it's complicated. He explained his plan, his voice low and measured, his words painting a vivid picture of a daring, dangerous gamble. He would lure Silas and his gang to a remote location, a deserted canyon on the edge of the Mercer Ranch, where he would confront them alone. At the same time, he would send a message to the sheriff in Dust Devil Ridge, informing him of Silas's whereabouts, giving him the opportunity to capture the outlaw and his gang. It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble that could easily backfire. But it was also the only way, Jack believed, to protect Caroline and Clara, to end the threat of Silas once and for all, and to atone for his past. Caroline listened, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She knew the dangers, the risks, the potential for disaster. But she also saw the determination in Jack's eyes, the unwavering resolve to do what he believed was right, to protect her, to protect their future. "It's too dangerous, Jack," she said, her voice trembling. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," he said, his voice firm. "This is the only way." "I'm going with you," she said, her voice unwavering. He shook his head. "No, Caroline," he said. "It's too dangerous. You need to stay here, protect Clara." "I'm not letting you face this alone," she said, her voice fierce. "I'm your partner, Jack. In everything." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and admiration, his gaze softening. "You're a stubborn woman, Caroline Mercer," he said, a smile playing on his lips. "And you're a stubborn man, Jack Slade," she retorted, her voice softening. They reached an agreement, a compromise. Caroline would stay at the ranch, but she would be ready to help, to provide support if needed. She would also be the one to send the message to the sheriff, ensuring that he arrived at the canyon at the right time. As they finalized their plan, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching the ranch at a fast gallop. Caroline and Jack exchanged a look of alarm, their hearts pounding in their chests. The rider drew closer, and Caroline recognized him. It was Sheriff Brody from Dust Devil Ridge, his face grim, his eyes filled with a determined glint. He reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over them, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Jack Slade," he said, his voice cold and hard. "I'm here to arrest you." The sheriff's shadow had fallen. Chapter 12. A Dance with Danger. Sheriff Brody's arrival was a stark, unwelcome jolt back to reality. The carefully constructed plan, the hope for a resolution, it all seemed to crumble under the weight of the sheriff's words, his presence, his authority. Caroline felt a surge of fear, a desperate urge to protect Jack, to shield him from the law, from the consequences of his past. But she knew she couldn't. She had to be strong for him, for herself, for Clara. "On what charges, Sheriff?" Caroline asked, her voice surprisingly steady, her gaze meeting Brody's unflinchingly. Brody, a man of middle age, with a weathered face and steely eyes, dismounted his horse, his movements deliberate and imposing. He held a crumpled piece of paper in his hand, a wanted poster, with a crude drawing of Jack's face, and the words Silver Creek Robbery printed in bold letters beneath it. "Robbery, murder," Brody said, his voice cold and hard. "The Silver Creek bank job. We've been looking for you for a long time, Slade." Jack didn't speak, didn't move. He stood beside Caroline, his body tense, his hand resting near his gun, but he made no move to draw it. He was a man caught between two worlds, the outlaw past he couldn't escape, and the fragile hope of a future he desperately wanted. "He didn't kill anyone, Sheriff," Caroline said, her voice fierce, her eyes blazing with defiance. "He tried to stop it." Brody looked at her, his expression skeptical. "That's not what the witnesses say, ma'am," he said. "They say he was one of the gang, one of the men who robbed the bank, who killed the teller." "They're lying," Caroline said, her voice trembling. "Silas Blackwood. He's the one who killed the boy. Jack tried to stop him." Brody's gaze shifted to Jack, his eyes narrowing. "Is that true, Slade?" he asked. Jack hesitated, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Silas pulled the trigger," he said, his voice rough. "But I was there. I was part of it. I'm responsible." Caroline felt a pang of despair. She knew Jack's honesty, his willingness to accept responsibility for his actions, would likely condemn him. But she also admired him for it, for his courage, for his integrity. "I'm taking you in, Slade," Brody said, his voice unwavering. "You'll have a trial, a chance to tell your side of the story. And Silas? Caroline asked, her voice urgent. What about him? He's the real killer. Brody shrugged. We'll deal with Blackwood when we find him, he said. Right now, my concern is you, Slade. Jack looked at Caroline, his eyes filled with a mixture of apology and regret. I'm sorry, Caroline, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't want this to happen. It's not your fault, Jack, she said, her voice choked with emotion. She reached out, her hand grasping his, the warmth of his touch a silent reassurance. Let's go, Slade, Brody said, his voice impatient. He gestured with his gun. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Jack nodded, his gaze lingering on Caroline's for a moment longer, a silent farewell, a promise of something. Then, he turned and walked towards the sheriff, his head held high, his shoulders squared, a man facing his fate with courage and dignity. Caroline watched him go, her heart breaking, her mind racing. She couldn't let him face this alone. She had to do something, anything to help him. As Brody and Jack rode away, disappearing into the distance, Caroline turned and ran towards the barn, her mind set on a desperate, dangerous plan. She would find Silas Blackwood. She would bring him to justice. She would clear Jack's name or die trying. She saddled Belle, her movements quick and efficient, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the risks, the dangers, but she didn't care. She was a woman driven by love, by loyalty, by a fierce determination to protect the man she loved. As she rode out of the ranch, the sun setting behind her, casting long shadows across the plains, she knew she was entering a dance with danger, a dance that could cost her everything.
But she was ready.
She was a woman of the frontier, a woman of courage, a woman in love. She glanced back at the ranch house. Clara was on the porch, watching. Caroline offered a weak, but determined smile. She would be back. She had to be. The dance had begun. Chapter 13. The Heart's Reckoning. Caroline rode hard, pushing Belle to her limits, the wind whipping through her hair, the setting sun casting long shadows across the plains. She had a destination in mind, a place where she hoped to find information, a clue, anything that could lead her to Silas Blackwood. She was headed for Silver Creek, the town where the robbery had taken place, the town where Jack's life had changed forever. She knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but she had to try. She had to do something to help Jack, to clear his name, to bring Silas to justice. As she rode, her mind replayed the events of the past few weeks, her encounter with Jack in the storm, the kiss in the barn, the shared secrets, the declaration of love, the sheriff's arrival. It all felt like a dream, a whirlwind of emotions and events that had swept her away, transforming her life in ways she could never have imagined. She thought of Jack, his strength, his courage, his vulnerability, his love. She loved him, she realized, with a depth and intensity that she had never felt before, not even with Thomas. It was a love born of adversity, of shared struggles, of a connection that transcended the boundaries of their different worlds. But it was also a love threatened by the past, by the shadows that clung to Jack, by the enemies he had made. She knew the risks, the dangers, but she didn't care. She was willing to fight for him, to risk everything for him, to die for him. As darkness fell, she reached the outskirts of Silver Creek, the town a cluster of dim lights in the distance. It was a small, quiet town, seemingly untouched by the passage of time, but Caroline knew that beneath the surface, secrets lurked, memories lingered, wounds remained unhealed. She rode into town, her senses on high alert, her hand never far from the pistol she carried. The streets were deserted, the saloons dimly lit, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of music or laughter. She dismounted in front of the town saloon, the rusty spur, the name a fitting description of the weathered, dilapidated building. She tied Belle to the hitching post, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She didn't know where to start, who to ask, how to find the information she needed. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, and pushed open the saloon doors, stepping into a dimly lit room filled with the smell of smoke, whiskey, and sweat. The room was sparsely populated, a few cowboys and miners nursing their drinks, a couple of women in gaudy dresses sitting at a table, a lone piano player tinkling out a melancholic tune. All eyes turned to her as she entered, their gazes curious, suspicious, unwelcoming. She was an outsider, a stranger, a woman alone in a man's world. She ignored their stares, her gaze sweeping the room, searching for a friendly face, a clue, anything that could help her. She approached the bar, her boots echoing on the wooden floor, her voice steady and calm. "Whiskey," she said to the bartender, a burly man with a grizzled beard and a wary expression. He poured her a drink, his eyes scrutinizing her, his silence questioning. "I'm looking for information," she said, her voice low, her gaze meeting his. "About the robbery. The Silver Creek bank robbery." The bartender's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "That was a long time ago, ma'am," he said. "Best forgotten." "It's not forgotten," she said, her voice firm. "Not by me. Not by Jack Slade." The mention of Jack's name sent a ripple of murmurs through the room, the patrons exchanging glances, their expressions wary, suspicious. "Slade, he's in trouble," she said, her voice pleading. "He needs help." "Slade's trouble is his own making," the bartender said, his voice cold. "He didn't kill that boy," Caroline said, her voice fierce. "Silas Blackwood did. I need to find him. I need to prove Jack's innocence." The bartender looked at her, his expression softening slightly, a flicker of something in his eyes. Perhaps it was sympathy, perhaps it was pity, perhaps it was recognition. "Silas, he's a ghost," the bartender said, his voice low. "No one knows where he is. No one wants to." "There has to be someone," Caroline said, her voice desperate. "Someone who knows something." The bartender hesitated, his gaze shifting around the room, as if weighing the risks, the consequences. Finally, he leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Old Maggie," he said. "She lives on the edge of town. She sees things. She knows things." Caroline felt a surge of hope, a flicker of possibility. "Where can I find her?" she asked. The bartender gave her directions, his voice low, his words cautious. "Be careful, ma'am," he said. "Old Maggie, she's not to be trifled with. And neither is Silas Blackwood." Caroline nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She thanked the bartender, paid for her drink, and left the saloon, stepping back into the cool night air. She mounted Belle, her mind racing, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She had a lead, a name, a direction. She was one step closer to finding Silas, one step closer to saving Jack. As she rode towards the edge of town, towards old Maggie's cabin, a sense of unease settled upon her. This was a reckoning of the heart, and she knew not everyone would survive it. Chapter 14. Where the River Bends. The ride to old Maggie's cabin was fraught with a sense of foreboding. The moon, shrouded in thin clouds, cast an eerie, intermittent light on the landscape, making the familiar shapes of trees and rocks seem distorted and menacing. Caroline's senses were on high alert, her hand never far from her pistol, her ears straining for any sound that might indicate danger. The bartender's warning echoed in her mind. "Be careful, ma'am. Old Maggie, she's not to be trifled with. And neither is Silas Blackwood." She knew she was walking into a dangerous situation, a world of secrets and shadows, where the line between truth and lies was blurred, where trust was a rare and precious commodity. She found old Maggie's cabin nestled in a small clearing near a bend in the river, a dilapidated structure that looked as if it might collapse at any moment. Smoke curled from the chimney, a faint light flickered in the window, a sign of life in the otherwise desolate landscape. Caroline dismounted, tying Belle to a nearby tree, her heart pounding in her chest. She approached the cabin cautiously, her boots crunching on the dry leaves, the silence broken only by the sound of the river flowing nearby. She knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping against the weathered wood, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. A moment of silence, then a voice, raspy and ancient, called out from within. "Who's there?" "My name is Caroline Mercer," Caroline said, her voice steady and calm.
I need to speak with you, Maggie.
It's about Jack Slade. The door creaked open, revealing a small, wizened woman with piercing blue eyes and a face etched with wrinkles, her white hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was dressed in a simple, faded dress, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, a gnarled walking stick clutched in her hand. "Come in, child," old Maggie said, her voice raspy but surprisingly strong. "I've been expecting you." Caroline stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the cabin. It was a small, sparsely furnished room, the air thick with the smell of herbs and wood smoke. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls, a few shelves lined with jars and bottles, a simple wooden table and 2 chairs, a cot in the corner. It was a place of simplicity, of solitude, of secrets. "You know why I'm here?" Caroline asked, her voice low, her gaze meeting Maggie's unflinchingly. Maggie nodded, her piercing blue eyes scrutinizing Caroline, as if seeing into her very soul. "The boy Jack," she said. "He's in trouble." "Yes," Caroline said. "He's been accused of a crime he didn't commit. The Silver Creek robbery. They say he killed the teller." Maggie chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that sent a shiver down Caroline's spine. "They say a lot of things," she said. "But the truth is often hidden." "I need to find Silas Blackwood," Caroline said, her voice firm. "He's the one who killed the boy. He's the one who framed Jack." Maggie's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "Silas, he's a dangerous man," she said. "A devil in human form." "I know," Caroline said. "But I'm not afraid of him. I need to find him. I need to bring him to justice." Maggie studied her for a moment, her gaze intense, her silence unsettling. Finally, she nodded, a slow, deliberate movement of her head. "I can help you," she said. "But it will come at a price." Caroline's heart skipped a beat. "What price?" she asked. "The truth is often painful," Maggie said. "It can reveal things you don't want to know, things that can break you." "I'm prepared for that," Caroline said, her voice unwavering. "I need to know the truth, no matter how painful it is." Maggie smiled then, a slow, knowing smile that revealed a glimpse of something ancient, something powerful. "Very well," she said. "I will show you the way. But be warned, child. The river it bends. And sometimes it leads to unexpected places." Maggie led Caroline outside, to the back of the cabin, where the river flowed, its waters dark and mysterious under the moonlight. She pointed to a spot on the bank, where the river curved sharply, forming a small, secluded cove. "Silas, he likes to hide," Maggie said. "He likes places where the water runs deep, where the shadows linger. He's like a snake, slithering through the darkness, leaving his poison wherever he goes." "Where is he?" Caroline asked, her voice urgent, her gaze fixed on the river. "He's close," Maggie said. "Closer than you think. He's been watching you, waiting for you. He knows you're looking for him." Caroline felt a chill run down her spine, a premonition of danger. "How do you know?" she asked. Maggie smiled, a cryptic, knowing smile. "I see things, child," she said. "Things others don't. I hear the whispers of the wind, the secrets of the river. I know the language of the shadows." "Tell me where he is," Caroline said, her voice pleading. "Please." Maggie pointed to the cove, to a small, almost imperceptible path that led into the dense undergrowth. "Follow the river," she said. "It will lead you to him. But be careful, child. The path is treacherous, and the destination uncertain." Maggie then looked deeply into Caroline's eyes and uttered one final warning. "And be very careful who you trust, Caroline Mercer. Not everyone is who they seem." Caroline nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She thanked Maggie, her voice filled with gratitude and apprehension. She knew she was embarking on a dangerous journey, a journey that could lead her to salvation or destruction. She mounted Belle, her hand resting on her pistol, her gaze fixed on the path that led into the darkness. The river bent, and Caroline followed, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. The river would lead her. But to what? Chapter 15. Gunfire and Grace. The path along the river was narrow and overgrown, the dense undergrowth pressing in on Caroline, the darkness deepening with every step. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, the silence broken only by the sound of the river flowing nearby and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the brush. Caroline rode slowly, cautiously, her senses on high alert, her hand never far from her pistol. She knew Silas could be anywhere, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. Maggie's warning echoed in her mind. He's been watching you, waiting for you. He knows you're looking for him. She followed the river as it twisted and turned, the path becoming more treacherous, the terrain more rugged. She had to dismount several times, leading Belle through rocky passages, across shallow streams, over fallen logs. The moon, now hidden behind thick clouds, offered little illumination, casting the landscape in an eerie, almost surreal light. Caroline felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition of danger that she couldn't shake. She was alone, vulnerable, in a world of shadows and secrets, where the line between hunter and hunted was blurred. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, the sharp crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, too deliberate to be an animal. Caroline froze, her heart pounding in her chest, her hand tightening on her pistol. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steady and calm, though her heart was racing. Silence. Then, a voice, cold and menacing, echoed from the darkness. Well, look what the river washed in." Caroline recognized the voice. Silas Blackwood. He stepped out of the shadows, a tall, imposing figure with a cruel smile and eyes that glinted like ice in the moonlight. He was dressed in black, a gun in each hand, his stance relaxed, confident, predatory. "You've been following me," Caroline said, her voice unwavering, her gaze meeting his unflinchingly. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You made it easy, little lady," he said, "trailing after your outlaw lover like a lovesick puppy." "He's not an outlaw," Caroline retorted, her voice fierce. "He's a good man. You framed him." Silas laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Good man?" he said. "Slade? He's a killer just like me. He just doesn't have the guts to admit it." "That's a lie," Caroline said. "He tried to stop you. He tried to save that boy." "He was weak," Silas said, his voice dripping with contempt. "He always was. And now he's going to pay the price." "You're not going to touch him," Caroline said, her voice unwavering. She drew her pistol, her hand steady, her aim true. Silas raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "You think you can stop me?" he asked. "You're just a woman." "I'm more than you think," Caroline said, her voice cold and hard. He laughed again, a cruel, mocking sound. "We'll see about that," he said. He raised his guns, aiming at her, his finger tightening on the triggers. Caroline fired, her shot echoing through the night, the bullet striking Silas in the shoulder, throwing him off balance. He roared in pain and rage, firing back, his bullets whizzing past Caroline, one grazing her arm, drawing blood. The gunfight erupted, a chaotic dance of death and defiance, the sound of gunfire echoing through the night, the flashes of light illuminating the darkness. Caroline fought with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, driven by love, by loyalty, by a fierce determination to protect Jack, to defeat Silas, to survive. She ducked behind a tree, taking cover from Silas's relentless fire, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She was outnumbered, outgunned, but she wouldn't give up. She wouldn't surrender. She reloaded her pistol, her hands shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to find a way to outsmart him, to outmaneuver him, to kill him. She peered around the tree, spotting Silas reloading his guns, his back momentarily turned to her. It was her chance. She stepped out from behind the tree, her pistol raised, her aim true. She fired, her shot hitting Silas in the back, sending him sprawling to the ground. He lay there, groaning in pain, his gun slipping from his grasp, his body writhing in agony. Caroline approached him cautiously, her pistol still trained on him, her finger on the trigger. She stood over him, her face a mask of determination and grief. "It's over, Silas," she said, her voice cold and hard. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with hatred, with pain, with fear. You bitch," he gasped. "It's over," she repeated, her voice unwavering. Suddenly, a shot rang out, a bullet striking Caroline in the side, throwing her to the ground. She cried out in pain, her pistol slipping from her grasp, her body convulsing. Another figure emerged from the shadows, a man Caroline had never seen before, a gun in his hand, a cruel smile on his face. One of Silas's men. He approached Caroline, his gun aimed at her head, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Any last words, lady?" he sneered. Caroline lay there, helpless, bleeding, her life slipping away. She closed her eyes, her mind filled with images of Jack, of their time together, of their love. A shot rang out, a different gun, a different angle. The man standing over Caroline crumpled to the ground, his gun clattering on the rocks. Caroline opened her eyes, her vision blurred, her body numb. She saw a figure standing over her, a familiar figure, a figure she had thought she would never see again. Jack. He was there. Somehow, someway he was there. Chapter 16. The Outlaw's Code. Jack knelt beside Caroline, his face etched with worry, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fear. He gently examined her wound, his touch sending a wave of pain through her, but also a surge of comfort, of reassurance. "Caroline," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Are you all right?" "I think so," she said, her voice weak, her breath coming in ragged gasps. You came." "Of course, I came," he said, his voice fierce. "I told you I wouldn't let you face this alone." He ripped a piece of cloth from his shirt, pressing it against her wound, trying to stanch the bleeding. How did you get here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I escaped," he said, his voice grim. "I had help." He looked up, his gaze meeting hers. He didn't need to explain. She understood. His friends, the outlaws he had ridden with, they had helped him escape from Sheriff Brody. It was a risky move, a desperate gamble, but it had saved her life. "Silas," she said, her voice urgent. He's still alive." Jack nodded, his gaze shifting to Silas's prone form, his expression hardening. "I know," he said. "I'll deal with him." He stood up, his gun drawn, his eyes fixed on Silas. He approached him cautiously, his finger on the trigger, his stance ready for anything. Silas lay on the ground, groaning in pain, his body writhing in agony. He looked up at Jack, his eyes filled with hatred, with fear, with defeat. You traitor," Silas gasped, his voice weak. "You betrayed us, you betrayed me." "I didn't betray you, Silas," Jack said, his voice cold and hard. "You betrayed yourself. You betrayed the code." "The code?" Silas scoffed, his voice filled with bitterness. "There is no code, Slade. Only survival." "There was a code," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "A code of honor, of loyalty, of justice. You twisted it, corrupted it, used it to justify your own greed, your own violence. You were always weak, Slade," Silas said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Too soft, too sentimental. You never had what it takes to be a real outlaw." "Maybe you're right," Jack said, his voice softening. "Maybe I'm not an outlaw. Maybe I never was." He lowered his gun, his finger releasing the trigger, his gaze filled with a mixture of pity and regret. "I'm not going to kill you, Silas," he said. "I'm going to let the law deal with you." He turned away, walking back to Caroline, his heart heavy with the weight of his past, with the choices he had made, with the consequences. He knelt beside her again, his touch gentle, his eyes filled with concern. "We need to get you back to the ranch," he said. "You need a doctor." What about Silas?" she asked, her voice weak. "I'll tie him up," he said. "And I'll send word to Sheriff Brody. He'll come for him." He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight, his arm around her waist. She leaned against him, her body weak, her head spinning, but her spirit unbroken. They walked slowly, painfully, back towards the path, towards Belle, towards home. As they walked, Jack explained how he had escaped. His former comrades, a small band of loyal outlaws who had also grown disillusioned with Silas's cruelty, had intercepted Sheriff Brody and his deputies, creating a diversion that allowed Jack to slip away. They hadn't wanted to hurt anyone, Jack explained, just to give him a chance to make things right. They had lived by a code, a twisted code, perhaps, but a code nonetheless. And Jack, in their eyes, had never truly broken that code. Caroline listened, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and understanding. She knew Jack's friends were outlaws, criminals, but she also saw their loyalty, their sense of justice, their humanity. They reached Belle, and Jack carefully helped Caroline into the saddle. He mounted behind her, his arms around her, holding her close, protecting her from the cold, from the darkness, from everything. They rode slowly back towards the ranch, the moon now shining brightly, casting its silvery light over the plains, illuminating their path, guiding them home. The outlaw's code, it seemed, was a complicated thing. But in the end, it had saved them both. Or had it simply delayed the inevitable? Only time would tell. Chapter 17. A Stolen Kiss Under the Stars. The ride back to the ranch was slow and agonizing. Caroline, weakened by blood loss and pain, leaned heavily against Jack, her body trembling, her head resting on his shoulder. He held her close, his arms a protective shield, his presence a source of comfort and strength. The moon, now high in the sky, cast a silvery glow over the landscape, illuminating their path, guiding them home. The night was still and quiet, the air cool and crisp, the silence broken only by the sound of Belle's hooves and their own ragged breathing. Almost there, Caroline, Jack said, his voice low and reassuring, his breath warm against her ear.
Just hold on.
She nodded, her eyes closing, her body weary, but her spirit unbroken. She trusted him, she loved him, and she knew he would get her home. He would keep her safe. As they neared the ranch, Caroline saw lights flickering in the distance, the warm glow of lanterns and lamps, a beacon of hope in the darkness. She heard voices, shouts, the sounds of activity, of concern. Clara. She had forgotten about Clara. Her daughter must be frantic with worry, wondering where they were, what had happened. They rode into the ranch yard, greeted by a flurry of activity. Clara rushed towards them, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with relief and fear.
Mama,
she cried, her voice trembling. What happened? Are you all right? I'm okay, Clara, Caroline said, her voice weak, her body swaying. Just a little hurt. Jack helped her dismount, supporting her weight, his arm around her waist. Clara rushed to her side, her arms wrapping around her, her touch gentle and loving. You're bleeding, Clara said, her voice filled with alarm. What happened? It's a long story, Caroline said, her voice hesitant. I'll explain later. They helped her into the house, settling her on the sofa, her body aching, her head spinning. Clara immediately set about tending to her wound, her movements quick and efficient, her hands gentle and caring. Jack stood by, watching, his face etched with worry, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and love. He felt responsible for Caroline's injury, for putting her in danger, for everything. I'll go get the doctor, he said, his voice rough. No, Caroline said, her voice surprisingly strong.
Stay. Please.
He hesitated, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes filled with a question. Stay with me, she said, her voice pleading. He nodded, his heart filled with a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief and gratitude. He sat beside her on the sofa, his hand reaching for hers, their fingers interlacing, their touch a silent connection, a reassurance, a promise. Clara finished bandaging Caroline's wound, her touch gentle, her eyes filled with concern. You need to rest, Mama, she said. I'll make you some tea. She left the room, her footsteps receding, leaving Caroline and Jack alone in the quiet stillness of the house. Thank you, Jack, Caroline said, her voice soft, her gaze meeting his. For everything. He smiled, a gentle, loving smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "I told you I'd protect you," he said, his voice low. "You did," she said. "You saved my life." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his touch sending a warmth through her that chased away the lingering chill of the night. "I love you, Caroline," he said, his voice a whisper, his eyes filled with a love that was both fierce and tender. "I love you too, Jack," she said, her voice choked with emotion, her heart overflowing with a love she had thought lost forever. He leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both passionate and tender, a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that defied the past, the present, the future. It was a stolen kiss, a moment of peace and intimacy amidst the chaos and danger, a promise of something more. The kiss deepened, their lips clinging to each other, their bodies pressed together, their hearts beating as one. It was a kiss that spoke of love, of loyalty, of forgiveness, of hope. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked together, their hearts filled with a love that was both overwhelming and undeniable. "We'll get through this, Caroline," Jack said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering.
"Together."
"I know," she said, her voice confident, her heart filled with a newfound strength. The stars twinkled outside, watching over them, witnessing their love, their courage, their resilience. It was a stolen kiss under the stars, a moment of grace in a world of violence, a promise of a future that was still uncertain, but filled with hope. The future, however, held more than just hope. It also held the sheriff and Silas, and all that was still unresolved. Chapter 18. Redemption Song. The arrival of Dr. Miller, roused from his sleep by a frantic Clara, brought a temporary reprieve from the emotional intensity of the night. He examined Caroline's wound, his touch professional and reassuring, his words calming and optimistic. "You're lucky, Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "The bullet passed clean through. No major damage. Just rest and let it heal." He cleaned and bandaged the wound again, gave Caroline some laudanum for the pain, and instructed Clara on how to care for her. Then, with a final reassuring nod, he took his leave, promising to return in the morning. Clara, still shaken by the events of the night, hovered over Caroline, her concern evident in her eyes, her touch gentle and loving. She helped her mother into bed, settling her comfortably, tucking the blankets around her. "Tell me what happened, Mama," Clara said, her voice soft but insistent, her gaze searching Caroline's.
"Please."
Caroline hesitated, her mind still reeling from the night's events, her body aching, her heart heavy with the weight of her secrets. But she knew she couldn't keep the truth from Clara any longer. She owed her daughter the truth, no matter how painful, how difficult it might be. She took a deep breath, her gaze meeting Clara's unflinchingly, and began to speak, her voice low and measured, her words painting a vivid picture of the night's events, of Jack's past, of Silas Blackwood, of the gunfight, of everything. She spoke of her love for Jack, of his courage, of his vulnerability, of his redemption. She spoke of her own fears, her own doubts, her own hopes. Clara listened, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and understanding. She had always known her mother was a strong woman, a woman of courage and resilience, but she had never imagined the depths of her strength, the extent of her love. "Oh, Mama," Clara said, her voice choked with emotion, her arms wrapping around Caroline, holding her close. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, Clara," Caroline said, her voice gentle, her touch reassuring. "Just understand." "I do," Clara said, her voice firm. "I understand. And I support you. Both of you." Caroline felt a surge of relief, a wave of gratitude washing over her. Clara's acceptance, her understanding, it meant everything to her. Jack, who had been standing silently in the doorway, listening to their conversation, stepped forward, his face etched with emotion, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and love. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice rough. For everything." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and acceptance. She had always been wary of Jack, suspicious of his past, of his intentions. But she also saw the love in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice, the change in his heart. "Take care of her," Jack, Clara said, her voice firm. "She deserves it." "I will," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "I swear it." He sat beside Caroline on the bed, his hand reaching for hers, their fingers interlacing, their touch a silent connection, a reassurance, a promise. The night was still and quiet, the house filled with a sense of peace, of reconciliation, of hope. The storm had passed, the wounds had been tended, the secrets had been revealed, the love had endured. But the future was still uncertain. Sheriff Brody would be back, Silas Blackwood was still alive and awaiting trial, and Jack's past, it would always be a part of him. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jack made a decision. He would face the consequences of his actions. He would surrender to Sheriff Brody, tell his story, and hope for justice. He knew it was a risk, a gamble, but it was the only way. He couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding. He had to face his past, to atone for his mistakes, to earn his redemption. He kissed Caroline goodbye, a tender, lingering kiss that spoke of love, of hope, of farewell. Then he rode out alone, to meet his fate, to sing his redemption song. His fate and Caroline's and the future of the Mercer Ranch. It all hung in the balance. The song, however, was not yet finished. Chapter 19. The Long Road Home. Jack rode towards Dust Devil Ridge, the rising sun casting long shadows before him, the landscape unfolding in a panorama of rolling hills and vast, open plains. He felt a strange sense of calm, a peace that came from accepting his fate, from making the decision to face his past, to seek redemption. He knew the risks. Sheriff Brody might not believe his story. The witnesses from Silver Creek might still identify him as the killer. He could spend years in prison or even hang. But he also knew that he couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding. He had to face the consequences of his actions, to atone for his mistakes, to earn his freedom. He thought of Caroline, her love, her courage, her unwavering support. She was his anchor, his inspiration, his reason for wanting a new life, a life free from the shadows of his past. He reached Dust Devil Ridge, a bustling frontier town, filled with the sounds of activity, of commerce, of life. He rode through the streets, his head held high, his shoulders squared, a man facing his fate with courage and dignity. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, a small, unassuming building with a sign that read Sheriff Brody Justice Served. He tied his horse to the hitching post, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing. He took a deep breath, steeling his nerves, and pushed open the door, stepping into the dimly lit office. Sheriff Brody sat behind his desk, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. He recognized Jack immediately, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his hip. "Slade," Brody said, his voice cold and hard. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I came to surrender, Sheriff," Jack said, his voice steady and calm, his gaze meeting Brody's unflinchingly. Brody's eyes narrowed, his expression skeptical. "Surrender?" he asked.
Why?
"I want to tell my story," Jack said. "The truth about Silver Creek. About Silas Blackwood. About everything." Brody studied him for a moment, his gaze intense, his silence questioning. He seemed to be weighing Jack's words, assessing his sincerity, trying to decide whether to believe him or not. Finally, Brody nodded, a slow, deliberate movement of his head. "All right, Slade," he said.
I'm listening.
Jack began to speak, his voice low and measured, his words painting a vivid picture of his past, of his involvement with Silas Blackwood, of the Silver Creek robbery, of the young teller's death, of his escape, of his redemption. He spoke of his regret, his remorse, his desire to make amends, to start a new life. He spoke of Caroline, of her love, of her courage, of her unwavering support. Brody listened, his expression unreadable, his silence occasionally punctuated by a question, a clarification, a challenge. He was a shrewd man, a seasoned lawman, and he wouldn't be easily swayed. Jack finished his story, his voice hoarse, his body weary, his heart heavy with the weight of his confession. He looked at Brody, his eyes pleading, his fate hanging in the balance. "That's the truth, Sheriff," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. "I swear it." Brody remained silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on Jack, his mind weighing the evidence, the testimony, the truth. Finally, he spoke, his voice slow and deliberate. "I believe you, Slade," he said. Jack felt a surge of relief, a wave of gratitude washing over him. He had been believed. He had been given a chance. But Brody continued, his voice hardening. "You were still part of it. You were there. You have to answer for that." Jack nodded, his heart sinking. He knew this was coming. He was prepared for it. "I'm ready to face the consequences, Sheriff," Jack said, his voice firm. "There's going to be a trial," Brody said. "In Silver Creek. You'll have a chance to tell your story to a jury, to present your evidence, to defend yourself." "And Silas?" Jack asked. "What about him?" "He's in custody," Brody said. "Thanks to your information. He'll be tried alongside you." Jack felt a sense of satisfaction, a sense of justice. Silas would finally face the consequences of his actions. He would finally pay for his crimes. When is the trial?" Jack asked. "A few weeks," Brody said. "I'll need you to stay in custody until then." Jack nodded, his heart heavy but resigned. He was prepared to do whatever it took to earn his redemption, to prove his innocence, to win his freedom. The long road home was still ahead of him. It would be a difficult journey, a challenging path, but he was not alone. He had Caroline, he had Clara, and he had hope. He had told his story, and he would face his trial. The truth, he believed, would set him free. Chapter 20. Sundown's Embrace. The weeks leading up to the trial were a time of anxious waiting, of quiet preparation, of unwavering support. Caroline, despite her injury, was a constant presence at Jack's side, visiting him in the Dust Devil Ridge jail, bringing him food, books, and most importantly, her love and encouragement. Clara, too, had come to accept Jack, seeing the genuine love between him and her mother, recognizing the change in his heart, the sincerity of his desire for redemption. She visited him as well, offering her support, her understanding, her friendship. The town of Dust Devil Ridge was abuzz with talk of the upcoming trial, the return of Jack Slade, the capture of Silas Blackwood, the legend of the Silver Creek robbery. Opinions were divided, some believing Jack's story, others condemning him as an outlaw, a murderer. Caroline and Clara faced their share of whispers, of judgmental stares, of outright hostility. But they stood strong, united in their support for Jack, their belief in his innocence, their love. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The small courtroom in Silver Creek was packed, every seat filled, the air thick with anticipation, with tension, with the weight of judgment. Caroline and Clara sat in the front row, their hands clasped together, their hearts pounding in their chests. They watched as Jack was led into the courtroom, his hands shackled, his face pale but determined, his eyes searching for theirs. He smiled at them, a brief, reassuring smile that conveyed his love, his gratitude, his hope. Sheriff Brody, acting as prosecutor, presented his case, calling witnesses who testified to Jack's involvement in the Silver Creek robbery, identifying him as one of the men who had terrorized the town, who had killed the young teller. The witnesses were mostly townsfolk, their memories clouded by time and fear, their testimony influenced by rumors and prejudice. They painted a picture of Jack as a ruthless outlaw, a cold-blooded killer, a villain. Caroline and Clara listened, their hearts sinking, their hope dwindling. It seemed as if the evidence against Jack was overwhelming, the witnesses' testimony damning. Then, it was Jack's turn. He took the stand, his voice steady and calm, his gaze meeting the jury's unflinchingly. He told a story, the truth about his past, about his involvement with Silas Blackwood, about the Silver Creek robbery, about the young teller's death, about his escape, about his redemption. He spoke of his regret, his remorse, his desire to make amends, to start a new life. He spoke of Caroline, of her love, of her courage, of her unwavering support. He admitted his guilt, his responsibility for being there, for being part of the gang, but he vehemently denied killing the teller. He insisted that Silas Blackwood had pulled the trigger, that he had tried to stop him, that he had failed. His testimony was powerful, moving, sincere. He spoke from the heart, his words ringing with truth, with emotion, with conviction. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on Jack, every ear listening to his words. Even Sheriff Brody seemed affected by his testimony, his expression softening, his gaze questioning. Then, Caroline took the stand. She testified about her relationship with Jack, about his character, about his kindness, his generosity, his love. She spoke of the night of the gunfight with Silas, of Jack's bravery, of his willingness to risk his life to protect her. Her testimony was heartfelt, passionate, unwavering. She was a woman fighting for the man she loved, a woman defending his honor, a woman believing in his redemption. Finally, Silas Blackwood took the stand. He was a shadow of his former self, his body weakened by his injuries, his spirit broken by his capture. He denied everything, blaming Jack for the robbery, for the murder, for everything. His testimony was weak, unconvincing, filled with lies and contradictions. He was a desperate man, trying to save himself, even if it meant condemning an innocent man. The jury deliberated for hours, their decision weighing heavily on the fate of Jack Slade, on the future of Caroline Mercer, on the justice of Silver Creek. Finally, they returned, their faces somber, their verdict uncertain. The foreman stood, his voice trembling slightly, and read the verdict. On the charge of murder, not guilty. Caroline and Clara gasped, their tears flowing freely, their hearts overflowing with relief, with joy, with gratitude. On the charge of robbery, guilty. A hush fell over the courtroom. Jack had been cleared of the murder, but he was still guilty of the robbery. The judge sentenced Jack to 5 years in prison, a sentence that, while harsh, was far less than what he could have received. It was a compromise, a balance between justice and mercy. Jack accepted the sentence with grace and dignity, his head held high, his shoulders squared. He had faced his past, he had told his truth, and he had been partially redeemed. Caroline and Clara rushed to him, embracing him, their tears mingling with his, their love unwavering, their support unconditional. 5 years, Caroline whispered, her voice choked with emotion. We'll wait for you, Jack. We'll always wait for you. I know, Jack said, his voice firm, his gaze meeting hers. And I'll come back to you. I promise. He kissed her then, a long, lingering kiss that spoke of love, of hope, of a future together. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that defied the prison walls, the years of separation, the uncertainty. As the sun set over Silver Creek, casting long shadows over the town, Jack Slade was led away, a man who had found redemption in the heart of the woman he loved, a man who had faced his past and earned a second chance. The long road home was still ahead of him, but he would walk it with courage, with dignity, with love. The embrace of the sundown was both an ending and a new beginning. Epilogue. 5 years. It was a lifetime, and yet, it passed in the blink of an eye. Caroline, with Clara's unwavering support, ran the Mercer Ranch, her days filled with the familiar routines of work, of tending to the cattle, of mending fences, of waiting. She wrote to Jack every week, her letters filled with news of the ranch, of Clara, of the changing seasons, of her unwavering love. She received letters from him in return, his words filled with longing, with hope, with stories of his life in prison, of the men he had met, of the lessons he had learned. Clara married a local rancher, a good man named Samuel, who loved her dearly and respected her mother's unconventional relationship. They had a child, a little girl named Rose, who brought a new joy to Caroline's life, a reminder of the enduring power of family, of love, of hope. Caroline aged gracefully, her hair turning silver, her face etched with lines of worry and laughter, her eyes still shining with the same fierce spirit, the same unwavering love. She never gave up on Jack, never doubted his return, never stopped waiting. And then one day it happened. A rider appeared on the horizon, approaching the ranch at a slow, steady pace. Caroline, standing on the porch, shading her eyes with her hand, recognized the silhouette, the lean frame, the way he sat his horse with an almost familiar ease.
Jack.
He had returned. He was older, his face weathered and lined, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and joy. But he was still Jack, the man she loved, the man she had waited for, the man who had come home. He dismounted, his movements slow but deliberate, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes locking with hers. He smiled, a slow, crooked smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, almost boyish. Caroline, he said, his voice rough with emotion, his name a soft caress on his lips. Jack, she said, her voice trembling, her heart overflowing with a love that had endured the test of time, of separation, of everything. They walked towards each other, their steps slow but certain, their eyes never leaving each other's. They met in the middle of the ranch yard, their arms wrapping around each other, their bodies clinging together, their hearts beating as one. It was a reunion, a homecoming, a redemption. They stood there, embracing, under the vast, open sky, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows over the plains, painting the scene in shades of orange and gold. It was a sundown's embrace, a moment of peace and joy, a promise of a future together, a future free from the shadows of the past. He had served his time. He had paid his debt to society. He was a free man. And he was home. "I love you, Caroline," Jack said, his voice a whisper against her ear, his words a vow, a promise, a testament. "I love you too, Jack," she said, her voice choked with emotion, her heart overflowing with a love that had never wavered, a love that had endured. They kissed, a long, lingering kiss that spoke of love, of forgiveness, of hope, of a new beginning. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that celebrated their union, a kiss that promised forever. They walked towards the ranch house, hand in hand, their steps slow but steady, their future unfolding before them, a future filled with love, with laughter, with family. The long road home had been arduous, but they had reached their destination. Together. The end.